What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to College Football Talk with Peter Burtonette. In today's episode, I'm bringing you the final part in my three-part series on the Big Ten Conference, going over the top contenders and the favorites, and also ultimately going over my prediction for the conference championship game. But before I get into it, if you go on to enjoy this video, please feel free to leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel, and turn on those post notifications so you're always up to date whenever I upload. But starting things out, a team that is an anomaly kind of in the transfer portal era, that is Illinois. They were 10-3 last year. They bring back 17 starters, which is kind of unheard of in the transfer portal era from a 10-win team. They did get away with some games last year, close calls against Kansas, Nebraska, Purdue, and Rutgers, but they did win those games. So that's kind of something to continue to build off of from last year. At quarterback, they've got Luke Altmaier, who's kind of picture of efficiency, 22 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. So doesn't really turn the ball over much, makes smart decisions, doesn't throw for a ton of yards, but a good quarterback. They got 5 offensive lineman starters coming back, led by left tackle J.C. Davis. At running back, they've got 2 guys who combined for almost 900 yards and 7 touchdowns, Caden Fagan and Aiden Laufey. And then wide receivers, a little bit of a question mark, but Hudson Clement from West Virginia is a big pickup. He had almost 750 receiving yards last year. Statistically, they're kind of an average offense, but like I mentioned, kind of in those close games, this is a team that knew how to make the big plays and the drives at the right time to win games. Defensively, kind of a similar story. They were 31st in scoring, kind of middle of the road outside of that. They return a pretty good secondary, though, led by defensive back Xavier Scott, who was an all-Big Ten nickelback, and then Matthew Bailey. Gabe Jacas is a top 5 linebacker. I think in college football, he's back this year, and then defensive lineman James Thompson comes in from Wisconsin. This is a team, when we look at their schedule, they've got 2 tough road games early on, I think, against teams that are maybe a little under the radar this year. Duke out of the ACC. If you saw my video on the ACC, I think they actually can potentially get to the conference championship game. At Indiana as well, I think they're still going to be dangerous, even if they take a small step back. Home against USC, home against Ohio State. That'll be one of the prime games for an upset watch. At Washington and at Wisconsin. I think those last 2 are probably 2 games they win. I think those first 2 they probably split, and similarly, I think it'd be most likely they beat USC and lose to Ohio State. But I could see them, maybe either losing both of those games or maybe potentially even winning both. So if I had to pick a record for this team, I think 9-3, but 10-2 is certainly a possibility. I think best case scenario is probably 11-1, but I think realistically, I think 9-3 is probably what I'm going to go with for the Fighting Illini. Next up, it's Michigan. They were 8-5 last year, but they had probably the best finish among any team in college football outside of the national champions, and they beat those national championship Buckeyes anyways. So the question here, though, how good will Bryce Underwood be? He'll have to be pretty good. Because this offense ranked 113th in scoring, 130th against the pass, and 129th in total defense. They've got offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey. He's got some good experience coming in. Running back, Justice Haynes from Alabama, and an emerging star, Jordan Marshall. 3 offensive linemen are back, but the question for me is who's going to step up at wide receiver, because it's kind of hard to know. Samaj Morgan had some good numbers, but Colston Loveland is gone. And outside of that, not too many guys got a whole lot of yards or even catches last year, so definitely be a question for them to answer. Shifting gears to the defense, they held Ohio State to 10 points in that 13-10 rivalry win. Alabama to 13, the ReliaQuest Bowl win. They were number 19 in scoring, number 5 against the rush, and number 10 in total defense. Up front, they've got probably one of the best front sevens in college football. Edge Derek Moore, defensive tackles Rayshawn Benny and Trey Williams coming in from Clemson. And then their 2 linebackers, Ernest Hausman and Jayshawn Barham, are probably 2 of the best, I think, in college football. They make up probably one of the top 5 units, linebacking units in the country. And also a huge return this season is safety Rod Moore. He's back after missing last year with injury. He was obviously the hero of the 2023 win over Ohio State, picking off Kyle McCord to seal that win. In terms of games, they've got a tough one in Norman against Oklahoma in week 2, and then road games against Nebraska, USC, and then obviously that big home game against Ohio State to wrap it up. They I think we're pretty fortunate with their draw in the Big Ten this year. They avoid Illinois, they avoid Oregon, they avoid Penn State. You even look at some of the teams that are on the outside looking in. They kind of avoid some of those teams as well. So this is a favorable schedule. I could see them as they try to get Underwood kind of acclimated, maybe losing that game against Oklahoma early on, but being able maybe to win those other 2 road games that I mentioned, maybe dropping 1. And then I think by the time it gets to the end of the season, I think, again, they're the ones who are rolling in the game. I think they win it probably again this year. And so I think Michigan is probably 10-2 and could finish as good as 8-1 in the Big Ten schedule. So more on where I think they fall later in this video. Next up, though, I have Oregon. This is a team that was in the driver's seat really most of the season, especially after that win over Ohio State, that instant classic. They were Big Ten champions. They made the college football playoffs, but they have a lot of questions to answer after going down 34-0 and eventually losing by 20 to Ohio State in that Rose Bowl. Quarterback Nittany Moore is back as a starter. He started at UCLA and then sat behind Dylan Gabriel last year. He'll have a good running back alongside him, Mekhi Hughes coming in. He was a 1,400-yard rusher at Tulane. Evan Stewart is one of the top wide receivers, I think, probably in the Big Ten, maybe in college football. And then top recruit Dakorien Moore comes in, and an emerging star, Kenyon Sadiq, also is a key playmaker to watch. They have a top 5 offensive line in college football and overall a top 20 offense. I think that'll largely continue. I don't expect to see a big step back, especially considering kind of the talent that they have on the offensive line and some of those skill positions. Defensively, they were 16th in scoring, 15th in total. That's kind of spearheaded on the defensive line by Mateo Uagalele, who had 11.5 tackles for loss. Teatum Tuioti and Bryce Boddicker at linebacker are key guys to watch. In the secondary, it's going to be a new look. They've got 5 new starters coming in. The leader there, I think, is going to be defensive back Dylan Thieneman, who's coming in from Purdue. One of those players who was one of the few bright spots for Purdue and ended up leaving the program, and surrounded by, I think, even better talent, obviously, at Oregon will be big for him. Key games this year, they're at Penn State, home against Indiana, at Iowa, home against USC, and at Washington. If I had to guess right now, I think looking over that schedule, I think 10-2 is probably the most realistic mark. Penn State, to me, is their most likely loss, and I could see them potentially dropping one of those other games, but I could also see them finishing 11-1. But I think the Ducks are not quite as good maybe as they were last year, but they do have some good pieces coming in that could get them back to that level. Next up is Ohio State, the defending national champions, 14-2 last year. The question for them is, how do they reload after losing 14 draft picks to the NFL? Their quarterback battle is Lincoln Kiholtz and Julian Sayin, so that's kind of a question. It seems like it's still a pretty good battle as we head into mid-August. James Peoples is the running back. The proven, obviously, unit here, though, is that wide receiver group. Obviously, Jeremiah Smith, no need really to expand on it too much here. He's the best wide receiver in college football, and he has some good guys alongside him. Carnell Tate, Brandon Innes, and another one of those Purdue guys coming in to help out a really good program is Max Clare, who will definitely benefit from not having to be the guy and, having some of those one-on-one opportunities as well. The offensive line also gained some valuable experience last year in that college football playoff run. Some of those guys were kind of thrown into action last year when some of the key starters for Ohio State were injured. So that's big. Defensively, this team ranked first in scoring and total defense. They were third against the run and the pass last year, but they will have to certainly kind of adjust this season. They lose Jim Knowles to Penn State, the defensive coordinator, and they only have 3 starters coming back. However, those 3 starters are some of the best defensive players probably in college football. Caleb Downs, free safety, probably the best defensive player bar none in college football. Sonny Styles, one of the top linebackers. Cornerback Davison Igbinosun. The question to me especially is who steps up on the defensive line and in the secondary as well outside of Downs and Igbinosun. I think Jermaine Matthews stepped up in some key moments and kind of made good plays when he was called upon. But outside of that, who steps up at the other safety position and kind of, in that other part of the secondary? Then defensive line also, no starters coming back. Obviously, JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer were 2 I would say legends of Ohio State football, especially Sawyer at this point after that play against Texas. So those are questions. I think Kenyatta Jackson is one guy to keep an eye on there. But again, those are some of the questions. So these Buckeyes have some big questions, and it'll be answered week 1 when they go up against Texas. I think the first ever week 1, number 1 versus number 2 game, the Longhorns, at least in the coaches poll, we'll have to see where these teams fall in the AP poll. But week 1 at home against Texas, that's going to be a prove-it game for both teams. At Washington, at Illinois, home against Penn State, and at Michigan. Those last 2 games, recent trends and where they're being played would suggest probably a win for Ohio State over Penn State and a loss to Michigan. I mean, Ohio State has really owned Penn State since 2016. I think that was the last time they lost to the Nittany Lions. The flip side, Michigan hasn't lost to Ohio State since 2019. So I would expect both of those games to go similarly. I know Penn State is stacked, but I think that will be a tough game to win in the shoe. And then Texas, I think Texas also, I think guys like Colin Simmons and Anthony Hill will cause a lot of troubles for whichever Ohio State quarterback gets the nod. And those road games will be tough. Right now, I think Ohio State probably goes 10-2. I think 9-3 is possible. If they win against Texas, though, then I think they probably go 11-3. I think they probably have a loss in there somewhere just because it's so hard to go undefeated. But that Texas game is really the big one. If they lose that, I think 10-2, 9-3 is possible. If they win, I think probably 11-1 is maybe even likely. Finally, the team that many people have as the favorite in the Big Ten is Penn State. They were 13-3 last year, college football playoff semifinalists. I think they have the best core returning in college football this year. Not just that trio that they have on offense, but also on defense. Getting started, though, with that trio on offense. Drew Aller at quarterback, 1,000-yard running backs, and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Trebor Pena, the wide receiver from Syracuse, is a good addition. And then can't overlook the offensive line as well, which has 4 starters coming back. Shifting gears over to that defense, which ranked among the best in college football and has probably the best defensive coordinator coming in, Jim Knowles from Ohio State. Defensive linemen denied Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, and then in the secondary, A.J. Harris and Zakee Wheatley at safety. I think the only question, if there is one, or maybe a place where there's a little bit less experience, is at linebacker. Penn State's had some really good linebackers over the years. I think it's a question of who's up next. Who's the next, Micah Parsons, Abdul Carter, who's kind of the next guy to fill in that role. In terms of their schedule, they're home against Oregon, at Iowa, at Ohio State, home against Indiana, and home against Nebraska. Those last 2, I think, those are probably wins. And then I think those 2, Oregon and Ohio State, are somewhat of toss-ups. I think the fact that they're in Happy Valley for the game against Oregon gives them the edge there, and kind of on the flip side is a disadvantage going into Columbus. So I think they probably split those games. I could see them going either way. If I had to guess, I'd say they beat Oregon, lose to Ohio State. I think either way, though, they finish with probably the best or the second best record in the Big Ten Conference. Now, what I said about Ohio State, if they finish with 1 loss in conference and it's only to Michigan, I think that would leave us with Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State, all with 1 loss. This was a scenario we talked about, I think, back in 2016 or a few other years, really, when these teams were all really good. So I believe Michigan would, in this scenario, have the tiebreakers. They'd be 1-0 against the Buckeyes, no matchup against Penn State. Then actually, if Ohio State finishes with 1 loss in conference, they would go in ahead of Penn State. I think Penn State finishes 11-1. I think they get to the Big Ten championship game. There's obviously questions here. I'm not here to try to figure out the tiebreakers and all that, but I guess maybe if they lost once and Ohio State lost once, maybe the Buckeyes would get in ahead and they would play a rematch against Michigan, in which case a rematch, I think, potentially could go in the Buckeyes' favor. So really the Big Ten is up in the air. I had come into this video saying I think Penn State's going to win, and I could see them going undefeated. And if they went undefeated, that would bring Ohio State down to 9-3 in my projections, with 2 losses in conference. But if they don't, it would be Ohio State against Michigan again, and I think Ohio State would win that rematch in Indianapolis. So kind of a mess there. I do think Penn State, however, is the best team in the Big Ten. I just think that matchup against Ohio State might be one that they fall in again. So even though I think Penn State is actually probably the best team in the conference, because of tiebreakers and the fact that in my projections they would lose to Ohio State and Ohio State's lone loss would be to Michigan, that would actually bump Penn State out. because among those three teams, Penn State would have the loss to Ohio State would have the win over Penn State, but the loss to Michigan, so I think they'd be second among that group. And because Michigan has one win over Ohio State, they would be kind of the home team, so to speak, in these projections. So I actually, this season, even though I do think Penn State is probably the best team in the conference, I think that matchup against Ohio State and Columbus is really difficult. And I think it is just so hard to go undefeated. I know Oregon did it last year, but I think it really is. So I think actually this could be the year where we get Ohio State against Michigan as a rematch in the Big Ten championship game. I think Ohio State would win in that rematch, which means they get the automatic bid. I think Michigan finishes with a good enough record, whether it's 10-3 or 11-2 to get into the playoff. And then I think Penn State does as well with probably a mark of 11-1. So that is my predictions for the Big Ten this season. But that's all for my preview of the Big Ten this season. Definitely kind of threw a wrench in with that tiebreaker. I kind of realized that as I was filming. So we'll see how things shake out. I could see Ohio State losing that game to Penn State, in which case it would be Penn State against Michigan, and I'd probably go with the Nittany Lions there. But anyways, we'll just kind of see how the season shakes out. I guess my predictions, I'm going with Ohio State over Michigan in the Big Ten championship, even though they lose the regular season finale. But that's how it is in this Big Ten with kind of these preseason predictions, kind of run into it a lot. But that is all for this episode of College Football Talk. I'm your host, Peter Burtnett, signing out. Peace.